talk about the three different ways that you can use and declare variables in JavaScript: var, let, and const, and some of the differences between them. So the first big difference is that you can't redeclare let and const, but you can with var. So here we've got three declarations of name here, and then assigning three different values here. Run the file. There's no error. Can log it to the console. And we get John, because this is our most recent assignment here, but there's no error, there's no problem with doing this. Okay. And we can try this with let, and see we get this here. Identifier name has already been declared, so you can't do this more than once with let. And you can even not assign anything the first go around, you're still going to get that error. Okay. And so if we look at const in this context, we can try and do the same thing. We're going to get the same error. And we can even try and we were to try and just declare it and then assign a value here. We're missing, we get an error that says missing initializer in const declaration. So with const, you have to initialize it when you declare it at the same time, which makes sense. Okay. So then the next big difference is you can't reassign const, but you can with let and var. And actually kind of just talked about that a little bit, but just do a quick example here. You try and run this assignment to a constant variable uncaught type error. So we declare it and assign it here, and we try and reassign it here, and that's not allowed. And that's the whole point of const, basically, is it's a constant value. It's not allowed to change. Okay, and then we can see another example here with let, where we declare it and assign it here, and then we reassign it to 1, we reassign it to 4, and these different values. So add this in here. So we see here it's 4, and then when we run it here, it's Bobby. Okay, so no problem there. And then the same situation with var. Obviously, we can redeclare it as we saw above, so we can also reassign it, no problem. Okay. The next big difference is, and this is really more important, is that let and const, I shouldn't say more important, but let and const have block scope while var does not. So what does that mean? So block scope refers to any sort of block of code like this. If statements, different loops, switch statements, you're always going to have a block of code here. And the variables within this block essentially only exist within this block of code. So, for example, if we just console.log name here, what do you think we'll get? Okay, we get Steve. And we see here, oh, we actually have two declarations, two assignments. I thought we couldn't declare it more than once. Well, because this is in a different scope, this is in this block here, it essentially doesn't exist outside of it in the rest of the document here, at least in reference to calling it here. So it's no problem, it only exists in here, and if we were to console.log name here, okay, we get it here, and we get it here as well, Bobby and Steve, we get our two different values. Okay, so this variable name is scoped to this block of code here. Okay, and then up here, it's just scoped to the rest of the document. Okay, and the same thing is true with const. Okay, so if we log it again here, we get color blue here. We're not seeing this green log to the console because it's scoped to this block of code. And if we were to now log this, get our green, and then we get blue. Okay, now var doesn't have block scope. And here's a kind of classic example of this. And it's pretty contrived, but just to illustrate the point here, with var, so we have this array here, and we assign this variable I, set it equal to 20 here, and then we have our for loop. We're going to loop through the array and just log the a value of I, and then the value in the array at that index. And what do you think we would get here for I? On that. Okay, so we get our I values, we get the values in the array, and then we get a value of 3 here. Now you might think, oh, shouldn't this be 20? We assigned it here. Well, this is the difference with block scope. So this is a block here, and because it's var, it doesn't have block scope. And so this, instance of I exists in the same world that this instance of I does. And so when this runs through the loop each time and I is updating, it updates the value of I. And so this runs through, I is 0, 1, and 2. It gets incremented to 3, at which point this is no longer fulfilled. So this block of code doesn't run, and then it logs that next value of 3 here. Okay, so let and const have block scope, and var does not. So that's another key difference. You can run into these sort of weird scenarios, unexpected scenarios that will just introduce problems. So something to be aware of with block scope. And then the last thing I want to show you is related to hoisting, which is kind of a weird thing, but just to show you a few examples. It's just another example of the differences between the way these variables are interpreted in JavaScript. So here, if you were to, log this animal out, what do we expect? Dog, right? That's not a problem. What do you think we would get if we were to call it here? Or you might think that, animal doesn't exist yet, so, okay, so we're getting undefined. Now you might expect to get a reference error there, right? Because why are we even, undefined basically refers to, at least in the sense of variables, an unassigned variable. So this is kind of what this is. If you were to just have this declaration without an assignment and you logged it, that would be an undefined variable, which is what we're getting here, but we do have this assignment. So what's happening here is the variable is getting hoisted up, and this happens with var. And so essentially what this is sort of looks like, although it doesn't actually happen like this, doesn't get moved in your code, you're having this declaration up top, it gets hoisted to the top, and then gets assigned below. So it's like when you're calling it at this point, that's why you're getting that undefined value. Okay. Now, and that's different from how it would work with let and const. So let's keep this commented out. So console.log animal here. Right, that works as expected. But here, if we recall it above, okay, that's when we get that reference error. So it's not undefined because let and const aren't hoisted up. It's not hoisted up to the top. The declaration isn't hoisted up to the top of the document. Okay, and that's what you would expect and hope for. Okay, and so there's just another example of that. Okay, we get that, expect, and then here we get that reference error. Okay, not undefined like with var. So that's another difference between the variable types. So just to review, some big differences: you can't redeclare let and const, but you can with var. You can't reassign const, but you can with let and var. Okay, and that's constant. That's kind of easy. That's pretty intuitive. So constants aren't able to be changed, and they must be initialized too when they're declared. And then the difference is relative to block scope. So this is pretty key. So let and const have block scope, and var does not. So what does this all mean? Basically, var is older, and the reason that, or at least part of the reason that let and const came into being was to replace some of these minor issues and sort of oddities with var. So don't use var, use let and const. If you need to keep variables constant, use const. I like to, for the most part, just default to const unless I know right there as I'm typing out my code that I'm going to be changing a value, and it can be good just to use const, and then if you try and reassign it, you'll get an error, and then you can change it to let at that point too. People work different ways, but just use let and const, don't use var, and just kind of be aware of these differences. You may see var in some older documentation, some older code bases, so just be aware of these things, and yeah, I'm in good shape. Thanks for watching.